Welcome to the podcast, Nolan Lawson.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, how would you introduce yourself?
That's a good question. I guess I would say that I'm an open source contributor and blogger, and I work in the web performance space. So I work at Salesforce as a software engineer focusing on web performance. But a lot of people online probably know me more for my work on Pouchdb, which is a JavaScript database. I used to work on that. I've maintained a blog for a long time where I talk about various topics: Mastodon, web performance, open source maintainer guilt. And then also recently I've gotten really interested in decentralized social media. So I've been blogging a lot about Mastodon.
Yeah, and that's the reason or the way that I discovered you is that you actually maintain the Mastodon server, which I joined when I discovered Mastodon. That's
right. Yeah, you're on Toot.cafe.
Yeah. It's a nice one. So how did you end up running your own server? Was it a long path to get there?
It wasn't a long path. I would say that the duration between me learning about Mastodon and spinning up my own Mastodon server was probably 4 or 5 days, I want to say.
Oh, wow. I feel so slow.
I was really excited about it.
Yeah.
So I remember what happened. It was back in April of, I think it was 2017. There was like this big surge of people joining Mastodon for whatever reason. I mean, who knows? It's herd mentality. Who can predict how humans are going to react?
Yeah.
But I just saw that people were talking about it on Twitter. And so I was like, okay, this thing seems interesting. I'll check it out. And I did. And I had a lot of fun that weekend. I mostly just kind of was like just posting silly jokes and shit posting essentially.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't using it for anything serious. But I had so much fun that weekend. And then when I learned like what Mastodon was and how like, hey, this isn't just like some other, VC funded startup in the Bay Area that, wants to monetize my eyeballs. This is like a totally different kind of beast. This is an open source piece of software. It's decentralized. Then I got really excited about it when I realized the possibilities. And so a couple days later, I think I stayed up till probably 2 or 3 a.m. just getting this Ruby server to start correctly because I didn't know anything about Ruby. I was just kind of playing it by ear. But somehow it all managed to stay up. And my server is still up to this day. So knock on wood, I haven't messed it up that badly yet.
No, it seems to be working out pretty well. I'm not sure how I actually chose my server. I just felt that I should try one of the other ones. I mean, I think there were like, when I joined, there were like 2 or 3 servers that people recommended. And I think some of them were actually limiting how many people were allowed to join or something like that.
I tried that for a while, yeah, just to kind of keep costs under control because I wasn't sure like how the costs would scale as more and more people joined. Now I have a better sense of it, and so I'm pretty lax. I just kind of have open registration. Well, not quite open registration, but we can get to that later.
Yeah.
When we talk about spam and that kind of stuff, which is always fun.
Yeah.
So how did you find out about Mastodon actually?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have a few friends who are like, some are interested in like networking services and servers and stuff in general, and some are really interested in open source and the open web. So I think I think I may have heard it first through, I don't know, maybe someone like Brent Simmons or someone writing about the open web and sort of mentioning Mastodon, and then sort of falling down into a small, nice rabbit hole of like articles and links to people explaining what it was about. So I think I discovered it maybe, could it be a year ago? A bit more than a year ago? Because the thing is, when I thought, I should set up an account, this is exciting, then I discovered I already had an account. so it seems it was a 2-step process somewhere along the way.
That's funny. I think a lot of people have that experience of kind of like falling in and out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like they join and they kind of poke around for a while, then they leave, and then they come back, poke around for a while and leave.
Yeah.
That's okay. I mean, it's it's not the world's most active social media
which is
environment.
Nice.
In many ways, it's nice. It's kind of carved out its own niche because of that. I mean, I think in the beginning, like the aspirations, at least my aspirations, were grandiose, and I was thinking, this thing is going to overtake Twitter tomorrow.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Yeah. Why wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But now it's kind of, it's a lot smaller. It's a lot cozier. It's a lot more diverse in the sense of the the software and how people are kind of tweaking it to fit their own needs. I really like that there's a lot of different forks. Like there's the Glitch Social fork, which has some interesting ideas. There's Darius Kazemi has his fork now, which is blanking on the name. It's called like Home Server or something like that. I'll have to look up the name. But they all have kind of interesting ideas. Which is one of the things I really like about decentralized social media is that, as Twitter kind of starts to crack down more and more on what you can do with a Twitter client, we're seeing the opposite momentum in the Mastodon space.
Yeah.
Different servers are experimenting with different things. Different clients are popping up. I maintain my own client.
Oh, yes. Let's get to that as well. Yeah, I think that's such a great thing, because I really missed that about Twitter when it was all about like exciting clients and people were figuring out new stuff and, I can use it for this if I do a client with this opinion about stuff. It's so much nicer. And even the default web interface is kind of nice, actually, and powerful. It's not some super bare bones power user only thing.
Oh, the default Mastodon web interface, you mean? Yeah, it's quite good. Eugen, the maintainer, he's really, really good at what he does. Like I've learned so much from looking at that code base. I contributed to the Mastodon code base quite a bit early on before I decided that I wanted to splinter off and start working on my own web client, which Eugen has always been totally supportive of. He boosts me a lot when I talk about my web client, which is called Pinafore. Boosting in the Mastodon parlance is essentially retweeting, by the way, for your listeners.
Oh yeah, that's worth noting. And tweeting is tooting, or tooting is tweeting.
Yes. Tweets are toots, and retweets are boosts. And I think that's the only weird nomenclature in Mastodon.
Yeah.
Unless we start talking about the federated timeline, which is probably just way too deep, and way too nerdy, maybe even for for your audience. I'm not sure.
We'll put in some links so people can read up if they feel so inclined. But
that's a great idea.
Yeah, I like making extensive show notes, so it's part of my thing. So you started by contributing to the default Mastodon, the interface, or the whole server setup?
I think I mostly contributed to the front end, because my specialty is in front end development. I don't really know Ruby, so Mastodon is a pretty standard Ruby on Rails project with React and Webpack on the front end.
Oh.
But I'm really not familiar with the Rails world, and so I'm really hesitant to modify any of that code. Mm-hmm. But I felt pretty confident about contributing to the front end. I mostly wanted to go in and fix things like accessibility and performance, which are two things that I care about a lot.
Yeah, you've written about a lot of nice stuff about that as well. Thank
you. Yeah, well, luckily, by working on my own Mastodon client, which I mostly coded myself, I would say, there's lots of contributors, but I would say that about 90, maybe 95% of the code is written by me. Mm-hmm. It's really given me the opportunity to kind of delve deep on all these topics that I wanted to go into, but didn't really have the time to necessarily in my day job. And so that's actually proved to be the fodder for a lot of blog posts. Like I wrote a blog post about how to write a carousel, mm-hmm. which you would think a carousel would be a solved problem in 2019.
Yes.
But I kind of discovered that it's anything but. And of course, I'm never satisfied with just like taking some off the shelf, npm install carousel and you're done. Yeah. Like I always have to go in and be like, okay, what are the latest and greatest web standards, and what is the standard way of doing this? And then of course I always discover that there are browser differences and standards, gone through V1 and V2, but it's fun. I always learn something in the process.
Yeah, and like you say, usually if you want to drill down and get really good performance for something, it feels to me at least that you usually need to eventually find out what the library you just imported is building on and why. And it sort of removes the need for the library after a while sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's the goal of a lot of web standards, is that you wouldn't have to use a library in order to get the same functionality.
Yeah.
I do think it is a bit sad, though. I think you're absolutely right, by the way, but I do feel it's a bit sad that for the most part, I feel like I really mistrust a library that I install. Mm-hmm. If I don't know what it's doing exactly, I feel like it's always going to mess up accessibility. It's always going to mess up performance.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, the story of Van Halen and the brown M&Ms?
Oh yeah, the rider thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like they had a rider in their contract saying, there must be no brown M&Ms. And then if there were brown M&Ms, they knew that something was wrong, and they should like inspect every inch of the place to make sure there's nothing, structurally unsound. Like I feel like I treat open source projects that way, which is maybe kind of nasty and horrible, but it's like I go in there and I'm like, oh, they didn't realize that they should have done this instead of that. This is bad for accessibility. Now I'm suspicious of the whole project. And then I go in and just like write the whole thing from scratch myself. It's kind of sad though. There should be like good standard libraries out there that people can feel confident about. Like, no one should have to learn the entire web stack from top to bottom. Like, no one should have to be an expert in everything. But
that's a good point, and I guess that goes together with what you said about the standards should evolve to like include everything that's needed. Maybe that's the way to sort of go about it. If you need to learn too many layers of the stack, maybe part of the stack should sink down into the standards eventually.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's an interesting discussion going on in the web standards world. I'm not so much a part of that world anymore. I was when I worked at Microsoft on the Edge team. I was a little bit more involved in web standards, but I still keep an eye on it. And there's a new sort of set of standards that popped up that the Chrome team is working on called, they called it layered APIs. I think they call it built-in modules now. And the idea is essentially that, you remember the idea of the extensible web manifesto, which basically said, hey, we web developers, we know what we're doing. Just give us the low-level tools browsers, and we will build what we need on top of it. And now they're kind of walking that back a little bit, because I think some people on the Chrome team, I know that Alex Russell in particular has talked about this. They feel like that was a good idea at the time, but now it's kind of led to a lot of bloat, because people have to write so many libraries on top of the very, very bare bones, low-level web APIs. And so it leads to a bloat problem. And also this problem I talk about of like, you npm install something and you have no idea if it's actually performant and works cross-browser and does accessibility right. And so their idea is they'll start building these higher-level components and then distribute them in the browser, but in such a way that you could implement it in JavaScript. And I think in practice they implement these things in JavaScript. So far, I think there's only two. There's a key value store built on top of IndexeDB, and then I know another one they're working on is a virtualized list. And I think a reasonable third one would be something like a carousel, like the kind of thing I implemented. I think it's an interesting set of ideas. It's kind of an interesting discussion about whether the extensible web manifesto has kind of failed us. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah. It's not like there's one single simple answer to stuff like that. It always varies depending on what people do and how you look at it, I guess. Yeah,
definitely. And it's an ecosystem problem. Yeah. Ecosystems are always complicated because there's always like give and pull.
Yeah, there's always more than two people involved.
Precisely. Yeah, it's the same with as with social networks. It's complicated.
Yeah. It sums it up well. It's complicated. So when at what point did you start building your own Mastodon client?
I think I started. Let's see. I had some free time at the end of, I want to say 2017. Yeah, it would have been 2017. It was around the winter break, and I knew that I wanted to start building my own Mastodon web client, just because. So there are plenty of Mastodon clients out there. One of the nice things about Mastodon is that the API is very open, in the sense that the creator or the maintainer Eugen has really always thought of Mastodon as being API first. In fact, I think he said that when he implemented Mastodon, he wrote the API first and then tested it using curl. And then build the web interface after that. So his concept was he wanted it to be really easy to build clients on top of it.
Yeah.
And you can definitely see this in terms of the Apple App Store, like on iPhone, and the Google Play Store. There's plenty of Android clients, plenty of iOS clients. There's even some desktop clients. But what I felt was missing was good web clients, because I believe in the open web. Still, I guess I'm nostalgic and idealistic, and I feel like it should be possible to just build an app on the open web, like with modern web technologies, progressive web apps, all those kind of things.
Yeah,
service workers, all that good stuff. And for the most part, it actually has worked out really, really well. I've been surprised at how much you could do with a web client. Like I wasn't sure how well it would work at first.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because some things were kind of unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Like for instance, there's this concept on the web of cross-origin resource sharing, which is it's a fundamental security concern of the web. And it wasn't clear to me when I started out whether or not I would be able to build my client.com and have it actually talk to a Mastodon server and be able to communicate and share all the data, because I mean that's kind of there's some security concerns there.
Oh yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, so I discovered that actually Eugen had already thought about this, and that the Mastodon API was already setting the correct CORS headers, and so it was completely possible for me to build a web client and essentially build an entire Mastodon interface on my own website. So I created I got a domain. I got pinafore.social. I decided to name it after my favorite Gilbert and Sullivan play.
Nice.
Just it sounded like a good name. No one else had really used it for anything. It's nice and short and easy to remember. And so I started working on my own client, and kind of my goals early on were that I really, really wanted to get accessibility and performance right, and also have offline support work correctly. Just a lot of the stuff that I feel like a well-designed client should be able to do on the web. That's what I wanted to do. Yeah. I think I've had mixed degrees of success with that, but for the most part, like, people are using it, people are filing bugs. My wife uses it all the time. Actually, she's probably the number one reason I'm still developing it, is that it's her preferred Mastodon interface, and she's on Mastodon a lot. So I do a lot of wife-driven development. She tells me, Nolan, this thing doesn't work. And I'm like, God, okay, hand me your computer, let me pop open the dev tools, let me see what's going on. So I do a lot of that.
Yeah, that's a really powerful focus group there.
Oh, it helps a lot, yeah. And I'm much more motivated to help fix her problems than random people on the internet. Although random people on the internet can be very nice. I've especially gotten some nice contributions from people to the project. So it's been a really fun project to work on in my spare time.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like Mastodon people could be nice and kind as well. Maybe a bit more understanding on average of like problems. Or
they tend to be kind of a tech savvy group, which has upsides and downsides. Like the downside is that oftentimes they tell you, like, hey, you're doing it wrong. Like, I believe very strongly that the right way to do this kind of technical thing is this. But then that doesn't happen very often, though. The upside is that people can come in and contribute to the code base, and often they do. I've had whole features just completely contributed from community contributions. Like, I think push notifications were just a complete community contribution. So were keyboard shortcuts. Those are two things that I wasn't super interested in. And so somebody else just took up the reins and basically implemented the whole thing and just handed it to me. So that was really nice.
Yeah, that's the kind of contributions you're hoping for. So I think. So how does Pinafore compare to the standard Mastodon client now? Is there still a large difference between them? I seem to recall you writing something about the differences becoming smaller or something over time.
Yeah, I think they've been kind of converging, which is a good thing, because one of my goals was to have an influence on the Mastodon front end. And like I said, there's always been friendly communication between me and Eugen, the maintainer of Mastodon. Like, occasionally when he has an idea, he'll shoot me a DM and say, like, hey, what do you think about this? And we often talk glowingly about each other's work. It's not really a competition.
No.
Like, one thing that the Mastodon front end has done that I think was a really good idea that I hope I influenced, maybe I did, was to default to a single column interface. So before, when you were a new user and you would start up Mastodon or join Mastodon, you would see this 4-column interface, which is kind of reminiscent of TweetDeck.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of new people found it confusing, especially if they were coming from Twitter. It's just very overwhelming. There's a lot of stuff going on at once. If you're a power user, you're probably very comfortable with that. I think power users would prefer that interface.
Yeah.
But if you're a new user, it can just feel like, what's going on? What do I look at? Like, why is there so much stuff on the screen? So Eugen built a single column interface, which Pinafore has always had. Pinafore has just always been single column. I never wanted to have a multi-column interface. Some people have asked for it, actually, but my preference is single column. And I feel like if you want the multi-column, there's always the Mastodon interface.
Yeah.
But now the single column is default for Mastodon. I think that's much more, much easier for newbies to get used to.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that probably shows something about the age of my account as well, because my account has always been multicolumn.
Yeah, if you have an older account, then it'll stick to the old default. But if you have if you create a new account, then it'll be the single column. You can still go in and change the default though. It's in the settings.
Yeah, I should try it.
But I think for now the major differences between the two. I've been working on reaching feature parity with the Mastodon web interface, and for the most part, we're there. Like I recently implemented polls, which were a thing that Mastodon had added. Just this last weekend or two, I got a contribution to add Blurhash, which is basically this feature where if you have a sensitive image that's hidden behind a click, instead of just showing a plain gray color, it'll actually show kind of a preview, like a sort of like frosted glass, blurry preview of the image.
Yeah.
So that was contributed, and then I've been working on that a bit the last 2 weekends. Actually, this weekend, there was another interesting feature that I'm stealing from Mastodon, which is OCR. So,
cool.
So Mastodon makes it pretty easy, unlike Twitter actually, it makes it pretty easy to add a description to an image, which is good for people who are visually impaired or otherwise just have trouble understanding an image.
Yeah.
But one of the challenges is that especially if you're on a phone or something, it can take a long time to type that out. Mm-hmm. If you're say you're sharing a meme or something that has some text over an image, it can be really laborious to just go through and kind of like tap out that entire thing. Oh, yeah. And so some people just don't do it. But this new feature is that it'll do OCR. So I actually don't know what OCR stands for. It's optical character recognition.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah, so essentially it'll try to extract text from the image. And it can do that purely on the client side, which is kind of neat. So that's kind of a nice accessibility feature because it hopefully should encourage more people to add descriptions to their images for people who otherwise couldn't enjoy the content of the image. Yeah. So that's a really neat feature that I saw that Mastodon had been working on recently, and so I started working on it as well. Just I will just shamelessly take all the good ideas from Mastodon and put them in my interface.
Yeah. So how's that done anyway? Is there an API for stuff like that, or have they written it themselves?
There's an off-the-shelf library. I know. I just got done saying how much I hate off-the-shelf libraries, but in this case, I decided to use it because I don't think I could implement my own OCR from scratch.
No, me neither.
There's a tool called Tesseract.js that I'm using, and which Mastodon is also using. And I think what it is it's essentially a WASM port, or maybe just an Emscripten port. I'm pretty sure it's WASM. I need to inspect it a little bit more.
Would make sense for
WebAssembly. Sorry. Which is based on some open source OCR library, presumably written in C, I guess.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so pretty neat stuff. So again, lots of interesting experimentation in this space. Like it's just kind of neat to see all the different things that people are doing with their Mastodon clients. Oh, another differentiator, actually, thing I added to Pinafore, which doesn't exist in the main Mastodon client yet, anyway. Let's see. Is I recently decided to add a set of wellness settings. I've been listening a lot to kind of this discussion about the techlash broadly, just kind of these ideas of like mental health around social media. I've been thinking about that a lot, and I won't claim to be an expert on it, but I think there's some good advice out there that people can try out to see if it helps them, if they're feeling addicted or if they're feeling anxious about social media. So I added some wellness settings where like you can turn the phone to grayscale, turn the app to grayscale, which was a recommendation from Tristan Harris of the Center for Humane Technology. Oh. And some other settings you can toggle are like you can hide the follower counts, or you can hide the number of boosts or the number of favorites, which I think helps some people feel less anxious. I know that Instagram has also been playing around with this. They've been running an experiment where they turn off likes, but in my Mastodon client Pinafore, you can just go into the settings and turn all that stuff off if you want.
Yeah, it's. I mean, that's such a big thing. I mean, it all adds up as well. The difference between something feeling kind of like stressful or feeling nice and calm. It could be all the difference in those little things together.
Yeah, and I've noticed some Mastodon servers themselves experimenting with this. Turning off follower counts, things like that.
Yeah.
I think or maybe capping it. Like I think in Pinafore, I cap it at 10 because I'd heard from people that. They want to know if someone has less than 10 followers, because that's a good hint that it might be just a spam account. They just created an account today or something. So it's good information.
Yeah.
But there's lots of interesting experimentation around this.
Yeah. There's a lot of fun experimentation going on everywhere, it seems.
Yeah, and I think it varies from user to user as well, which is something good for people to remember. Like, I look at the way my wife uses social media, for instance, and for her, it's a completely different experience from me. Like, I don't have push notifications on. I filter out a lot of the notifications because I don't want to get every boost or every like, things like that. It's just it just that definitely, if not, causes me, if not anxiety, just like a lot of labor that I have to go through and read everything.
Yeah.
But for her, she's, I guess you would say she's on weird Mastodon, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So she is just constantly making jokes, and for her, like, kind of the more viral a piece of content is, the more she wants to engage in it. Like, in some other setting where you're not just making jokes and like riffing off of other people's jokes and kind of like sort of doing like improv comedy online. If you're not in that world, then the more viral a piece of content is, the more likes and boosts it has. It could be the more anxiety inducing it is, like it's something about politics or something about
yes
whereas in her world it's the exact opposite.
And
she actually loves the likes and the boosts because like she loves seeing people engage with her stuff. She knows she recognizes a lot of the names in the avatars. People will respond to her, and she enjoys seeing what they have to say because they're often riffing off of a joke that she made. So like no two social media users' experiences are the same. Like for my wife, like she would never want to touch these wellness settings. Like they just they're useless to her. But for someone else, it could be very, very helpful.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, it's also worth remembering. It's so easy to think that everyone should like adapt to me or something. If people just did clients my way, everything would be great. But no.
Yeah, and that's sort of the problem with something like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram is that, there are ways to customize the clients, but at the end of the day, like it's the design team at Twitter or it's the design team at Instagram that decides what the client can look like. And, with Mastodon, like the thing that still gets me excited about it is just the possibilities, all the different ways that people can modify a client or modify a server to meet whatever, however they want to use social media. And somehow it's all kind of cacophonous, but it's beautiful at the same time.
Yeah, it really is. It all works somehow.
It's amazing, but it actually does work. Yeah.
So you mentioned you were like chasing feature parity with the Mastodon client. Is there anything in particular you feel like you're missing right now?
I think that, let's see, once we get the Blurhash implemented and the OCR implemented, there's probably a few other things. I think it's mostly just bug fixes at this point. I mean, here's the thing. Like, if I wanted to implement every single bit of the Mastodon interface, it would take me a long time. Like, this thing's like, the admin panel. Like, do I want to make it so that you can moderate posts from Pinafore? Like, I don't know, because like there's already a big, it's kind of a niche use case. There's already a big admin interface to do this kind of thing. An admin user is already a power user, so they probably know how to go from one client to the other without too much difficulty. No, I would say there's not a lot of huge missing features so far. I'm still just focusing on the core competency of Pinafore, which to me is accessibility and performance. I'm actually especially proud of the fact that I've heard from at least two non-sighted users they preferred using Pinafore over the main Mastodon web client because they found it was just better in terms of accessibility.
Oh, that's awesome.
Which, I'm really happy about that because when I started working on Pinafore, I didn't really know anything about accessibility at all. And so I took it as an opportunity to learn. And fortunately, there was a guy who works at Mozilla who's non-sighted who really helped me out a lot and would write these really long issues explaining why, like, okay, in this part of the interface, you implemented it this way, but actually you should probably do it this way because on certain screen readers, it'll read it like that. And like, I learned so much. So it's just been a really helpful experience for me to learn more about the web. So I'm really grateful to the project for that.
I guess it has changed a bit how you think about other code you write as well. I mean, I feel like that usually happens when you learn about something like this. You start seeing the opportunities everywhere.
Oh, accessibility is amazing. I'm so glad I started learning about it. Like, I think for a lot of people, they think of it as a chore and like, oh, this is the thing I have to do because otherwise I'm a horrible person. But I think of it more as like, it's like once you realize that there's this whole other interface beyond what you what you think you know about web pages. Like you think a web page is just a series of rectangles, and it's rectangles on top of other rectangles, and to the left and to the right and above and below other rectangles. But then there's this whole semantic interface below that, and it almost feels like you're looking into the matrix. You're like looking at the code behind it, and it's like, oh, I can see the woman in the red dress or whatever.
Yeah,
and it's like it's very satisfying. Like I like that stuff a lot.
Yeah. I haven't worked too much in accessibility myself, but I think I discovered it a bit more a bunch of years back when there was some at that time prolific Apple developer started writing about accessibility and how he had discovered he had some disease that would worsen his eyesight over time, and he had turned on accessibility in all his devices and discovered A, just how good they were, and B, just how you should lay stuff out to make it accessible. And it was like, well, yeah, it's sort of a seeing the matrix thing. Oh, you can lay stuff out like this and it just works. You do this, and wow. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating, yeah. And also, luckily, it turns out that I think the number one thing I've learned about accessibility is that if you don't customize too much, you probably won't mess it up. Like if you just use a button, like if you just use a regular old HTML button, it will work the way that it's supposed to with keyboards, with screen readers, with mice, with whatever. If you try to get fancy and build your own thing, like I'm going to build a div and I can build a button from scratch, then you run into problems. And so I kind of learned early on, like, okay, if I don't like the style, like the default user agent style of a button, just go in there and just, do the CSS reset, set the border and the background and all that stuff to none or 0 or whatever.
Yeah.
And just go from there, because it's a lot harder to mess up that way.
Yeah.
Which is good. If the advice is basically do less, then that's pretty good advice.
Yeah, that's a lesson worth taking to heart. Do less, do it in more standard ways. Yeah, I'm still fighting that myself.
Oh yeah, so you're still fighting that in your own projects?
Yeah, I mean it's easy in quotation marks to cheat sometimes, but I try really hard, especially about letting a button be an actual button and stuff like that. Getting there, but have some people are a bit too enthusiastic about, oh, it should be styled exactly like this, and so, oh, I could do it with a div. I don't want to. Trying to fight it.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's almost a perverse thing that can happen in web programming, where like the more you know, the more you can mess things up. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like if you reach like 75%, expertise on something, that's when you're the most dangerous.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I can do everything.
Like I guess it's kind of a it's a funny situation, but to be fair though, I mean, to get to 100% or even 90%, you have to stop at 75%. Like you have to you have to start somewhere. So there's kind of no avoiding it, but it's just good to be humble and to remember that like you're learning as you go. Yeah.
I'm still curious about how to, because we'll probably need or want to add more accessibility to the app I do at work eventually. It's fun to start thinking about how it should work, because there's a lot of custom drawing, because we're basically drawing a kind of a calendar in a large part of the interface, and I'm not sure how to go about making that accessible in a good way and give people a good overview of basically calendar information, where there can be like hundreds of entries sometimes, and it can be laid out in very different ways. It's interesting stuff.
It's tricky, yeah. I found that probably the easiest way is just to use an actual screen reader and just kind of, take the time to learn the keyboard shortcuts. And I really like VoiceOver on Mac. I feel like that one is just the most intuitive to me in terms of the keyboard shortcuts and everything. It's by no means the most popular screen reader out there, but it's representative enough of how a screen reader will work. And if you play around with it and just think, like, if I were arriving on this page for the first time and I were non-sighted, like how would I want to navigate it? And then you learn that, like, well, if you kind of lay out the page in terms of like heading level 1 and heading level 2, then people can navigate around very easily. And sometimes you can put like hidden elements on the page that are only visible to screen reader that can give a little summary. Those kind of things are very helpful. At least that's what I've learned from working on Pinafore and talking with non-sighted users.
Did you end up adjusting a lot of layout stuff and things like that for when you started adding accessibility?
I didn't have to make any big changes, but I did have to kind of sprinkle in some things here and there. I had to think really hard about where I was putting heading level 1, heading level 2, that kind of stuff, because you really want kind of the structure of the page to be obvious. You don't want it to all be kind of flattened, like it's all just heading level 1.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about some other stuff. I was surprised adding keyboard shortcuts actually really helped, apparently, which was in my head. I don't know why it didn't occur to me that those two things would be related, but apparently it really does help out a lot of non-sighted people who or just keyboard users really prefer to have those keyboard shortcuts, even if it takes some time to learn them.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of surprising to me to learn that the keyboard shortcuts helped people out a lot. Another tricky thing I learned was that infinite loading lists can be really difficult for people on screen readers because or keyboard users, because it's kind of like you're sort of assuming like a mouse paradigm or a touch paradigm where someone's scrolling up or down and content
true.
automatically loads into view. And so I added an option to Pinafore where you can disable that, and then you just get a button at an explicit button at the top and the bottom of the timeline that says, "Hey, load more." And apparently people using screen readers tend to prefer that because they can actually like just explicitly say like, "I want to load more content right now," and then it loads, and they kind of understand what's going on with the page.
That's almost a wellness feature in itself, isn't it? It's much calmer. It doesn't extend the page every time I scroll.
In a sense, yeah, it could be a wellness feature too. Yeah, why not? But again, I'm not a huge expert in accessibility. I've just kind of been playing it by ear the whole time. I hope I've done a good job.
Yeah, it seems to be going in the right direction, definitely, by the feedback.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. And I think the main Mastodon project as well has been benefiting from people contributing to it. I often see pull requests where someone's contributing a performance fix or an accessibility fix. I'm actually, as part of my work on Pinafore, I helped improve the accessibility of Mastodon because there's a shared component that we use. Again, an off-the-shelf library, which I know I said don't use them, but here I am using another one, which is the emoji picker. It's really hard to implement an emoji picker from scratch. And you would think, like, this is another one of those things where you think to yourself, okay, it's 2019. Why does every web page need to implement its own emoji picker to handle every emoji on the planet and update every single year when the emoji or the Unicode Consortium or whatever comes out with a new version? But this is just the way things are right now. And you think, why do you even have to do this? Like, aren't the OS emoji pickers good enough? And no, they are not. Like, I'm on Ubuntu, for instance. There is no emoji picker, and there's no good emoji picker.
Oh, there's none at all
available. You can find emoji pickers. You can install some of them, and they are very rudimentary. They're not that great.
Yeah.
And then you also get into questions of like, so Mastodon supports custom emoji, and so people want to be able to use their custom emoji. And,
of course.
Ideally, you present it all in a single unified interface, and you sort it by which ones are the most frequently used, and et cetera, et cetera. So it ends up being that you kind of just have to implement your own.
Yeah.
I didn't want to implement my own from scratch, so I used this one called Emoji Mart, which is a React-based emoji picker, pretty popular. Mastodon also uses it. But one thing I noticed about it was that it essentially just didn't have good accessibility features, like in the sense that it was essentially, I would say, unusable for keyboard users or for screen reader users. Yeah. It was a lot of the like, I'll just use a div for everything. But instead of just complaining about it, I went in there and actually started contributing to the project. I became a maintainer. And then I just started kind of slowly fixing like component by component, making this one accessible, making that one accessible. I think it's in a lot better state now. I wouldn't say that it's perfect, but it's definitely a lot better now. And Mastodon has actually picked up the upstream changes. So I'm really happy that those changes kind of bubbled down to both Pinafore and to Mastodon. I guess that's the benefit of having a shared library.
Yeah. I mean, there are exceptions to every rule, and this seems like a great exception. Very well chosen exception.
Yeah, unless I have another, winter break from work and I decide that I want to build my own emoji picker from scratch. But I don't know. Knock on wood, I won't do that.
Do you think there's a big thing to be gained by doing that? Or
I think it can be done a bit better. Like, there's a few things I would change about Emoji Mart. Like I've programmed in React before, but I'm not the world's biggest fan. Like, I decided to code Pinafore using this framework called Svelte.js, which to me is I really like it in terms of an expression of what a web framework, what a JavaScript framework should be. compared to React. I also just tend to like the programming paradigm a little bit better. In terms of the programming paradigm, it's more like Vue, and I really like Vue compared to React. But more than anything, I think Svelte just kind of nails this concept of, if you look at the modern stack that most JavaScript developers or JavaScript app developers, let's say, web app developers are using these days, like it's really heavily based on compilers. Huge compiler tool chains. You're running TypeScript, you're running Babel, you're running all these Babel transforms and all this kind of stuff. And yet, at the end of the day, for the most part, people are, when they're using React, they're writing code that runs more or less exactly as written. Like it maybe gets transformed from JSX into JavaScript, but more or less exactly as written against a runtime library. So React, you just like take this big React.js dependency or React DOM dependency, and you drop it in, and it runs against that code. And the concept of Svelte is like, well, if we have this gigantic compiler tool chain, like why don't we just figure out what parts of the web platform you're actually using and just include that, just the minimum you need. So instead of like, when you use React, it contains all the code needed to render anything to the DOM in React, like any kind of like, button or input or any kind of field or any kind of element. Like, why do you need all that code if you're just using like 2 or 3 things? Like when you first go to a web page, like when you arrive at the landing page, it should require just the JavaScript needed to render that page, and then everything else should be progressively loaded. But React can't really do that. You have to just include the entire dependency. Mm-hmm. And so it's felt like the idea of just using a compiler to compile away all the stuff you're not using is, I think, really brilliant. And in my experience, it's been just a blast to work with. I really like the framework a lot, and I really can't sing enough praises about it. Like Rich Harris, the guy who has written it, is also the creator of Rollup and several other interesting projects. And he's a person I really, really admire. Like I actually knew him in New York when I lived there, and I would see him at JavaScript meetups occageally. And he's just like, to me, he is like the prototypical like mad scientist of JavaScript.
Oh, those are the best.
Oh yeah, so I'm already predisposed to like what he builds. But I think that Svelte is really knocked it out of the park. I think it's an amazing JavaScript framework.
Yeah. I only heard it mentioned a couple of times, but it's always been in these kind of positive terms. So I'm really intrigued by it.
Well, the good news is that I have a sample app that shows you can just build an entire web app out of out of Svelte.
Proof of concept.
And it works really well. There's kind of this question, I think, early on in Svelte of can it scale? Because the concept of, essentially the concept of Svelte is that for every component you have, it's going to take that code and then compile it down to something that, it's kind of like, let's say it's like the vanilla JavaScript you would have written if you wanted to take the time to write, your own JavaScript framework from scratch, and you were willing to sit there and laboriously type out every, like, if I have a component that has, properties foo, bar, and baz, I'm going to write a foo setter and a bar setter and a baz, and I'm going to actually type all these things out. Like, no one actually wants to do that, but that's what this framework does. But then the question was kind of, would it scale well? Like, as you wrote more components, would those costs kind of be amortized over the number of components, or would it just go up and up and up linearly with the number of components? And that may be the case, but what I found with Pinafore, at least, is that it doesn't scale so drastically that you end up with a gigantic blob of JavaScript at the end. Like, I'm always keeping an eye on the bundle size, and right now it's around 1 megabyte for 1 megabyte uncompressed, minified for all the JavaScript assets. Yeah, that's all the JavaScript assets. So when you land on the homepage, I think you download like maybe 30 kilobytes, and everything else is lazy loaded. So you're never going to hit 1 megabyte unless you're like, using the app and you're absolutely clicking in every single page, going to every single component. Like, that's the only case where you would actually get that 1 megabyte hit. Or if you run a browser that requires all the polyfills, because I lazy load the polyfills. Yeah. So I think in practice, it really works out.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. And Svelte handles all that progressive loading itself, basically.
In a sense. So you still would use the normal, like if you're using Webpack, you would still use the dynamic import syntax, and then Webpack would handle the code splitting and everything. That's what I'm doing with Pinafore. But it allows you to do the lazy loading in the sense that there isn't a gigantic like Svelte.js dependency that you have to dump in on first load of the page. Like the framework is kind of like spread out throughout all of your components that you write. Like every component has a little bit of Svelte in it, basically. And there is a small runtime library because there's some like helper functions that it would just be silly to repeat across every component. So there actually is a very small runtime, but I don't remember how big it is, but I want to say it's on the order of like, last time I looked at it, I want to say it was around like 7 or 8 kilobytes. Like, it's not very big.
That's okay.
It's pretty tiny. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's been really fun. Like, it's and it's been kind of joyful for me. Like, I think maybe one of the things that is sort of missing from the social media space, at least the centralized social media space, is just this spirit of fun and excitement. Like you mentioned that, you used to be excited using Twitter with all these different clients coming out, and I think people passionately working on these sorts of clients, aren't really doing that for Twitter anymore. If they're doing it at all, they're doing it for something like Mastodon, I think.
Yeah.
And so that's what gets me excited.
Yeah. I think I'm the same here. I've been missing that in lots of places for a long time.
Well, which makes sense, because like, just with the way that Twitter has made it more and more difficult to use their API, or there was a vibrant community of bot makers on Twitter, and then recently Twitter changed its rules about around bots, which, well, for obvious reasons, because there are good bots and bad bots, but I think you can make a strong case on Twitter there's maybe more bad bots than good bots.
Yeah, just guessing.
But that drove away a lot of really creative people. Like I already mentioned, Darius Kazemi. I think that one of his motivations for leaving Twitter, I don't know if he's entirely left Twitter, but one of his motivations for joining Mastodon anyway was that he could move his bots over there. And I believe he runs the main bot Mastodon instance. It's called bots in space, bots.in.space.
There's so many good domains to use.
That's the other thing I love about Mastodon is that, like, recently we've had all these new TLDs spring up.
Yeah.
Top level domains and it's just, you see so many funny ones on Mastodon. I'm trying to think, like, there's cyber.space, which is a great one. One I really love is godforsaken website. It's godforsaken.website. There's another one called banana.dog. It's just like, people just come with such, it's almost like a vanity license plate. Like, people love going around with, like, oh, I'm so and so at banana.dog. It's really funny.
Wait, what? It's perfect.
Yeah, print that on your business card, right?
Yeah, it's almost like a signifier. Yeah, we're Mastodon people. We are like this.
Exactly. Yeah. There's almost no .coms. It's really funny. Because like, why would you when you could be like a dot horse?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Mastodon is horse. That's a strange animal.
Nice. Some kind of mythical creature, maybe.
Ooh. There's always room for one more instance. I don't know. Do we have time to talk a bit more about the performance side of things?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have some time. Absolutely.
Yeah, because you've written a lot. It was pretty recently about performance measuring in browsers and making performant interfaces and stuff like that. And that's yeah. So I had a blog post. Let's see. I had a few blog posts about this. I had one about accurately measuring layout on the web. Oh yeah.
Which so some of this was stuff that I've been kind of thinking about at work because I work in performance. Some of it has been stuff I've been thinking about working on Pinafore in my spare time. But I just think there's a really interesting space in general around how do we measure performance of SPAs. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things you'd think would be a solved problem in 2019 because everyone's building an SPA right now, right? Or at least kind of feels that way. But I feel like when you move from the server rendered world to the SPA world, there's a lot of unsolved problems there.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, when you have a classic server rendered page, how do you measure like what is the most important performance metric? It's probably your load time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to measure the load time, there is just so many built-in APIs in the browser you can use. There's the load event, there's the DOM content loaded event. Google is coming out with all these new ones, like, first contentful paint, first meaningful paint. I don't even know what half these things are, what the difference is between them. But you have just this plethora of things that you can use out of the box, right? Mm-hmm. And most people understand it. You're talking to higher ups, you're trying to explain this metric, like they kind of get it. But now you move to the SPA world, and it gets a lot more complicated. The first load might not be your most important metric. Your idea might be that, what if you're Gmail, let's say? Like, the first load of Gmail is actually pretty slow, right? You're sitting there watching a progress bar load. But most people doesn't really bother them, right? Because they open Gmail once and they just leave it open in a tab forever. Yeah. Maybe they pin it. And at that point, what becomes more important is things like the performance of navigating between pages in the SPA, which the browser does not give you built-in APIs for that, because you're not doing a full actual like navigation. You're not actually going from one page to the other, hitting a server. The server is giving you a response. So now it's your job to write in JavaScript like your own system for managing for managing these timings and for giving them names and for deciding what's important and what's not. And it gets really complicated. So I wrote this blog post about how to measure style and layout, which I think is something that most JavaScript developers, most web developers don't really think about too much. Probably because it's kind of part of the like browser internals, and so it's sort of like inside baseball. Like that's browser things. I don't really understand what the browser is doing. I'm just not going to think about that. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there are things you can do. Like if you're, if the browser is taking a long time to calculate styles, then maybe you need to trim back your CSS a little bit. Or if the browser is taking a long time to lay things out on the page, maybe you have too many DOM elements, or maybe you're doing too many fancy things like flexbox inside of grid, inside of another grid, inside of I don't know. So there is stuff you can do, and it's important to actually measure those things. So that's what I wrote that blog post about. But I still think it's a really interesting question. Actually, in the so I said I'm not really involved in web standard stuff anymore, and I'm kind of not. But I was a sort of a fly on the wall in the last W3C Web Performance Working Group meeting, and the topic of how do you measure performance in an SPA was a huge topic. That they didn't really come up with a solution at the end of it, but I think they got a sense of like this is a big problem, and no one's really sure how to solve it yet. So hopefully there'll be some movement there from the browser vendors, and maybe they can come up with some kind of standard way that SPAs can measure their performance. But I think it's a really interesting space, and it's still actively being developed, and no one's quite figured it out yet. So I always find stuff like that really fascinating.
And you can make so much difference to the users as well if you manage to solve things in a good way, improve performance in those perhaps unexpected corners.
Oh yeah. And I think that's really important too, because it's so easy, especially if you're a professional developer. You probably are a geek, and you probably are. You might make a little bit more money than the average person, so you can probably go out there and buy like a high-end laptop, a high-end phone. You're always running the latest and greatest. You're on a super fast connection, and so it can be really easy to be blind to the performance problems of your average user out there. So one of the things I like about performance, I think it's really based on empathy. It's based on imagining like, okay, so if I were on a slower phone, if I were on a slower laptop, like would I enjoy this experience? And I think oftentimes if you dust off, I don't know, your 5-year-old laptop or your 5-year-old phone, and you actually load a project you're working on, you might be horrified at just how unusable it is. But the truth is that it's not an unsolvable problem, and you don't have to just tell your users like, oh, the solution is you need to go out and buy a $1,000 iPhone. Like it could just be that you need to go in there and just throttle your event listeners using requestAnimationFrame, or just include some fewer JavaScript dependencies, things like that. So I think that kind of empathy is really important, and it should feed the way you think about performance. Yeah,
definitely. What was? Oh, I lost my train of thought.
Maybe you wanted to ask me about the recent blog post about touch input or something.
Yeah, it was something around that, because that one was really, really interesting too, and I liked how, because you were writing about touch inputs and pointer events and how browsers were supporting them, right?
Yes, that's another space where definitely the browser support is uneven, but I like playing around in that area. I was working on an interface for Pinafore where you could choose a focal point on an image, which is another nice feature that Mastodon has, which is that when you have when you upload an image, oftentimes it'll be cropped, right? Depending on how it's displayed in the timeline. And what you don't want is the awkward crotch shot or something. Where, like, you have a picture of a person and then like their face is cut out, their feet are cut out, and it's just a really awkward picture. So you can actually choose a focal point. You can choose like, I want to zoom in on the face, or I want to zoom in on this part of the landscape, or whatever. But the interface for that is kind of tricky, because what you want something where someone can like tap with their finger and move the focal point around, or they can click with the mouse and move it around. Or maybe if they're on a Windows Surface Book or something, and they want to use a pen, or if they're on an iPad Pro, they want to use a pen and actually move it around. And so I want to use pointer events for that, because pointer events are the new browser standard that tries to unify, mouse, touch, pen, all these kind of things. Incidentally, it's a standard that was invented at Microsoft, and so
it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense. Yeah, I think they invented it around the time of Windows 8 because they were, building this kind of new version of Windows where like you had the touch input, you had the pen, you had the mouse, and they wanted to unify all these things. But what I found while working on it is that the browser support it's still not perfect. There's definitely still lots of browsers that haven't quite implemented pointer events yet. And in the beginning, I was using a polyfill, but this is definitely one case where I would vote against the off-the-shelf library. I ended up not using the polyfill because I found that when I measured the performance impact, it was a huge amount of overhead for every single touch event, basically, on browsers that didn't support pointer events. It would do all these abstractions and just cause a huge amount of lag when you're just moving your finger around. So I just decided to write my own fallback code.
Yeah.
But that was an interesting project, yeah.
Yeah, and it looked really nice and compact as well. I feel like that's the kind of thing that people maybe should try to do more. It's easy to think that, I pulled in this huge polyfill. It must be knowing exactly what it's doing, and I must need everything because otherwise nothing would work. I can't possibly figure this out on my own. But you can dig down a level or two and like read the specs and find the parts that you need and maybe write a bit fewer lines that have better performance.
Yeah, you can do that. I mean, that's essentially what I spent time doing, and like it is work definitely. But the upside is that people who aren't on the latest and greatest browsers or browsers that are perfectly in line with the standards, like in this case, I think it's mostly benefited mobile Firefox and Safari as well, which doesn't currently support pointer events. But again, that's also kind of an empathy thing, right? It's like not everyone is using Chrome, to put it bluntly. Like not everyone is using Chrome on every single one of their devices. And it's good to be empathetic towards those users. And in the process, you learn a little bit about how browsers work and how the web works. Like one thing I really appreciated during the time that I worked at Microsoft and the Edge team was it was actually really interesting to learn about the areas of the web platform where we weren't in front, where we were a little bit behind, because it teaches you a little bit about, we didn't prioritize these features because for the longest time, no browser had these features. Actually, the web worked fine. And then one browser came up with this innovation, and now it works that way. And then every other browser was like, well, that's kind of an interesting idea. I'll do my own take on it. Or maybe the browsers were like, actually, that's a fantastic idea, and we all want to do it that way. And it kind of, teaches you a little bit about the history of the web. Yeah. And it gives you a sense of how like everything was kind of built up by layers. The web is more like it's more like an organism that's kind of evolved over time. It has some vestigial organs sitting around there. You're like, why is that thing there? And it's like, well, it made sense at one point, but now it doesn't really make sense anymore.
Yeah, we don't dare remove it. Someone might be using it.
Gosh, there's a lot of that on the web. Yeah, just things that can never go away. But but they can make new standards, and people can opt into those. And so there's at least that silver lining.
Yeah. Did you have any particular big thing that you would like to throw away if you just could?
Oh, I mean, there's so many. Gosh, like cookies. Cookies are so bad. There's just so many things wrong with cookies. Let's see, local storage. I wish that local storage were replaced by Indexeddb. Unfortunately, I still use local storage in my projects. There's some cases where I can't quite use Indexeddb, and so that kind of bothers me. Definitely, well, think about something like pointer events. Like, once pointer events are widely supported in browsers, there's basically no reason to use touch events or mouse events, which is kind of a huge paradigm change for the web, right? That'd be nice if you could just say, hey, tell me when some pointer is pressed down. I don't care whether it's a mouse or a touch screen or anything.
Yeah, I'm looking.
So those are some good examples.
Yeah, good stuff.
And thankfully, the more you depend on these modern standards, typically the more performant they tend to be. I mean, browsers are, people working in browser vendors are pretty smart, and they won't typically add a new standard that is intentionally slower than the older standard. In fact, if anything, they usually opt for the latter thing. Yeah. So, like, for instance, there's some new APIs called one is called Intersection Observer, another is called Resize Observer, and they solve a pretty basic problem, which is that a lot of people want to be able to monitor something on the page, like an element, and figure out when does its size change, or when does it move across the screen, when does it cross some boundary? Like, say you want to have lazy loading images or something when you scroll into view, or for the Resize Observer, you don't know when someone else is gonna resize a box somewhere, and it's going to cause the layout to change. And especially with big organizations where it's multiple teams working on these components, it can be a real lifesaver to have something like Resize Observer to say, hey, browser, tell me when this element has changed size.
Yeah.
And one of the big benefits is that as opposed to something you might write yourself, you could kind of trust the browser vendors to do it correctly and to make sure that, I should hope so.
Yeah.
Hopefully they should be able to do it better than you could yourself. Otherwise, what's the point of having the standard?
Yeah. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. Is there any particular of those points you'd like to say something more about it?
Well, I guess I would just want to say to your listeners that if they're interested in decentralized technologies, open source technologies, definitely give Mastodon a spin, try it out. Just join any one of the instances. They're all good.
Yeah.
Try it out, see if you like it. I think it's a really fun and vibrant community. It's definitely not as big as Twitter, but it's it feels cozy, and so I think it's fun. So it's a fun place to bring your programming skills to.
Yeah,
if you are so inclined.
Yeah, and it doesn't drown you in notifications and stuff. There's no flood of things all the time, unless you want it, I guess.
True, yes. And you can always disable it. It's in the wellness settings.
Yeah, exactly. It's all good. Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining the podcast, Nolan. This has been super interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Frederick. It was fun talking to you.
Yeah. Take care.
You too.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.